hear me okay? Yes, good news. And I'm going to share my video as well. All right, and you can see me as well, I hope. Yes, awesome, Alana, thank you. Yes, great, thanks, Tess. So how is everyone this evening? Tired? Oh, Mark, anything that's happened to make you feel particularly tired? Bryony, good, that's awesome. Really good, that's really good, Ben. I've got to say, I'm apologizing a little bit. I think that I'm losing my voice. I've done so many wonderful debriefs with many of you, but I do feel like my voice is slowly going away. So I'm going to continuously drink water and just make sure that I can retain my voice as best as possible. Tess, looking forward to this session. Me too. We've got two incredible presenters that I will introduce you to formally a little bit later, but I'm also looking forward to it. Alana, hump day, I'm happy, agreed, yes. Oh, Kate, enjoying the end of the day wine with dinner and learning at the same time. What a combination. Catherine, understand that, stage 4 blues, absolutely. Evening, Rupen. Oh, thanks, Tess. Yeah, I'm well, thank you. I'm really enjoying, I've been doing so many 360 debriefs and I'm really enjoying doing those. My week has been filled with debriefs and I'm loving it. So thank you for checking in. Will, had a 2.5-hour strategic planning meeting this afternoon. What are we doing tonight again? Good question. We're handing over to you, Will, I think, to take this class. It sounds like a timely piece of work. Yeah, fantastic. And so how did everyone find last week's session? I've been thinking about Beyonce becoming president for the past week now. Yeah, it was very interactive, yes. And I'm not sure if you've seen that Candice sent a note to each of you. I've posted it in the discussion board with a series of links to some of the platforms that she uses for human-centered design. Oh, I'm glad, Tess. That's fantastic. That's awesome, Jenny. Thank you. Yes, they were interesting concepts. And yes, plenty of reflection on how to implement more. Yeah, thanks, Bryony. Really good. Already taken some bits into some strategy I'm working on. It went down well. That's awesome. I'm really pleased to hear. Well, tonight we're focusing on yes, it was, Megan, a lot of information, absolutely. And tonight's topic is strategic thinking and decision making. So again, just a reminder that we've now entered the elective phase. So there'll be a series of 7 electives. And again, just remembering that the requirement for this unit is to complete the portfolio entries for 4 of those 7 electives. And just checking in as well, just with the 360 debriefs, is everyone booking those in? Anyone feeling stuck, confused about any of what's happening with those at the moment? Or enjoying them? Any feedback at all? Yep, awesome, Rob. Great news, thank you. That's good, yep. Still waiting on it to come back. Yes, late work. Very insightful, great, Jessica. Yep, happy with the debrief, awesome. Sue was great, yes, thanks, Will. It is a valuable exercise, Anna, yes. Yeah, okay, trying to gather all my information into the development plan. Yep, it's a task, I think, Alana, absolutely translating all of that data because there's about 44 pages for each of you. There's a lot of data in there to translate. Oh, Bryony, it was contradictory. Can you tell us more if you're comfortable sharing? And Megan, yep, all good. Oh, with Susan, fantastic. Raymond, looking forward to tomorrow. Yes, curious to know the feedback from your new team. Yes, that will be interesting. So, Bryony, not sure if you're typing at the moment, but I'm just going to, oh, perfect. You were too reserved. I talk too much. I need to trust my insights more. I need to slow down and consider my answers. I see. And so the contradictory part, Bryony, was that okay? So you received two comments then. One was that you were too reserved, and one that you talk too much. Okay, I see. Oh, interesting. Okay. And were there themes? Were there contradictory themes, or just kind of or two comments that were contradictory? Two comments. Yeah, okay. Interesting. Because I think when they're isolated comments, I would encourage you to just consider that potentially as an outlier, unless there are themes that come through that quantitative data and the qualitative data as well. But it happened over a lot of points. That's really interesting. And Bryony, did you get the opportunity to explore this more with your coach? Or kind of have time to think about it and get a little bit of insight? Oh, Raymond, yes, it's a newish team, been over a year, but first detailed feedback survey. Yeah, wonderful. It's going to be a great opportunity then to have a look at those results. I'm glad you were able to have a good chat. Yes. Oh, good approach, talking to someone from work and making a plan. That's a wonderful way of tackling that. And Michael, report was great to outline blind spots, what I thought versus observers thought, some interesting insights. Absolutely. And if we kind of think back to class number 2, just around self-awareness, it is finding that balance between what we think about ourselves and that internal awareness piece, but balancing that with the external perspective. So I think doing a 360 is a wonderful opportunity. So tonight, we're just going to do a quick check-in just on some of that non-compulsory homework that we had from last week. And again, just going to reflect on anything that came out of last week's class. And then we have 2 incredible speakers with us. They're on the line at the moment, and I will be doing a formal introduction of them both shortly. But a welcome to Gary and to Zivit, who are here tonight to share their expertise. And then we'll finish up just with a standard wrap up. We'll talk about any questions, concerns, anything that's on your mind. I'm struggling with the unknown of the Johari window. Yeah, that's a good point, Alana. And I think something that sits in that quadrant is something that can at times be something that comes out of a therapeutic type intervention because it is unknown. It's something that then is brought into our consciousness. There were some unrealized strengths, Paris. Yep, identified within my evaluation. I marked myself lower in some aspects in comparison to my observers. Yes, definitely. Yep, Rupin, you too. Yeah, and sometimes I think it's an important data point just to reflect on, because sometimes it can be representative of sometimes we are overly critical of ourselves, or equally we might lack a bit of confidence in certain areas. So I think it's an interesting point just to reflect on. And Will, yep, you were the same too, a bit self-critical. Yep. All right, so thinking back, and again, we can continue the 360 reflection as well. So we're not limited in terms of just talking about human-centered design, but anything anyone wanted to share again about 360s or about human-centered design. There was a TED talk of Guy Kowalski that I posted, and also an IDEO human-centered design paper as well. So keen to get your thoughts on those and or 360s as well. Paris, good point. Yes, could be considered a blind spot. Absolutely. I've just got my notes to the right, so I'm just going to scroll through some of my notes that I took. I don't know if anyone read the IDEO paper just around the mindsets required for human-centered design, and they had, I think, 7 mindsets, things like empathy, optimism, iteration, something that they call creative confidence, making, embracing ambiguity, and learning from failure. And I think mindsets is a really key part of being able to implement a process such as human-centered design. Did anyone get a chance to watch the talk or to read that paper? Yes, Alana, there's exclamation points there. Were they? Did you learn things from them? Did they kind of resonate with you? I thought the TED talk was great. Yeah, me too. I actually thought it was quite funny too. He's quite humorous in the way he delivered that. Yeah, Michael agreed. Jumping to the next curve was a point that sticks out, definitely. Ice harvesters didn't become ice manufacturers, and ice manufacturers didn't become refrigerator businesses. Don't get tunnel vision. Absolutely. Yeah, he was really funny. Haven't had the chance to read the paper. Saw it was 192 pages. Oh, goodness. It shouldn't have been. Oh, sorry. Yes, it will. It's a long one. Sorry, Raymond, it is. I focused more on the top section, just in terms of digesting all that information. The top part talks about the process of human-centered design and the mindsets required for human-centered design, but the actual document is a toolkit. So if you're ever implementing that as a process within your organizations, there are different strategies and tools and exercises that you can use. Will, you're a week behind assignment in other unit due tomorrow. We'll be catching up during the break. Yeah, no problem at all. Don't worry, be crappy was a good point. Definitely doesn't have to be perfect. Yes, exactly. And Bryony, that's something that when I listened to that, I found it actually quite confronting, because I have a tendency to be a perfectionist. So I'm all about working, and making something perfect. But the more I spend on it, the more my goalposts shift. And I don't think I ever necessarily put things into action as best I should. Yep, agreed, Alana. Churn, baby, churn. Yep. Yep, no problem, Raymond. Yes, and Rupen, was that the too true comment about perfectionism? Yes, yes. So easy to get caught up, I think, because the goalposts will, yes, they always shift, and it can always be better. And I think with human-centered design, there's that important bit, is that iteration process. So we can kind of launch something and continue to iterate, as opposed to waiting for it to be completely perfect. It is exhausting, Michael. Absolutely, it is. It's just a very hard thing to psychologically snap out of, I think. What do the other perfectionists in the room think about that? Do you find it exhausting as well? Because that's just my personal opinion there. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Anyone identified? Yeah, exactly. Oh, Mark, I envy you. Time consuming, absolutely. Anyone got any strategies that have worked for getting them out of that perfectionism cycle, being stuck in that? Tess, yeah, really like the psych safety around failing fast to succeed sooner. Absolutely. It does highlight the importance of mindset and leadership, I think, as well, being able to support people to fail as well. Alana, yes, but also satisfying when reaching your ideal of perfection, your idea of perfection. Yes. Agreed, Jessica. If everyone was a perfectionist, it'd make my life easier. Yes. Strategy 1, get a crazy job and be too busy for perfection. Oh, interesting. Yes. And Catherine, is your job crazy? Yep. Megan, the Margie Hartley podcast was a reality check. Absolutely. Yeah, I really enjoy her podcast series, but it certainly was a reality check. And was that, Megan, was that the podcast around self-awareness, that 4-part or 3 or 4-part series, or was that the career derailers, or was it something else entirely that you listened to? I had a manager who had a saying, 100% right 100% of the time. It's been hard to break away from that, as it would be, Bryony, absolutely. Mentor those around you, yes, as a strategy. That's a great one, Jessica. Separating perfection and completing a high level of work works for me. Yep, great one, Ben. Exams are a great example. Too much time on one question to get it right when 11 other questions are not done at that level. Get the even approach. What an awesome example. Thank you, Mark. Side note, I saw that Deakin students, we get a free access to Canopy. Great for documentaries. That is awesome. Thank you for sharing, Alana. It was the recommended ones, but I ended up downloading others. Yeah, there's some great ones in there, Megan. Focus on outcomes, not perfect content. That's a great strategy too. I'm easily satisfied by the best. Winston Churchill. Yes. Yeah, that is pressure. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your insights. And I encourage you, as always, to keep this discussion going on the discussion board and with each other, whatever works for you. I might stop there just because I'm going to hand over to our presenters. But before I do, I'd like to do a formal introduction, and I would like to read their bio. So I'm just going to face the opposite direction just so I can introduce our wonderful guests appropriately and accurately. So Dr. Zivit Inbar is the founder and CEO of Different Thinking, a consulting practice that specialises in people, culture, leadership and performance strategies for growth. Zivit has over 20 years of experience and expertise with building high-performance teams, driving high-level strategies and processes at the board and executive levels, private and listed, local and global organisations in China, APAC, Europe and the US. Her board portfolio includes roles as a chairwoman, non-executive director, company secretary and advisory board member. Zivit is a member of Standards Australia AI Trustworthiness and Governance Committees, a member of Harvard Alumni Entrepreneurs Leadership Team in Australia, and a non-executive director at Rural Northwest Health. Dr. Inbar is an adjunct professor at Deakin University's MBA program, a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School Leadership Decision Making Executive Program, a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and a fellow certified member of the Australian Human Resources Institute. Her PhD is focused on strategic thinking and strategy implementation by Western companies operating in China, and she is the author of The Ethical Kaleidoscope: Values, Ethics and Corporate Governance. So welcome, Zivit. We also have Gary Watson, Director of Odyssey Business Improvement. Gary is a channel management and automotive industry specialist, specialising in market strategy with extensive executive, director level, consultancy and advisory experience. Gary has over 30 years experience in the automotive and consultancy industries and also has direct experience across retail, franchising, not-for-profit and manufacturing sectors. He serves on company and advisory boards in the retail, not-for-profit, disability support and academic sectors, and is a credentials assessor on Deakin Co.'s Masters of Professional Practice program. He has been a contributor, an associate lecturer, an adjunct professor to the Deakin MBA since 2015 and is a member of the Deakin MBA Advisory Board. Gary holds a Deakin MBA and is currently completing a Masters of Business Law with 1 unit left. So welcome, Zivit and Gary. It's an absolute pleasure to have you both, and I'm really looking forward to you both sharing your expertise. I am going to turn off my video and my sound and hand over firstly to you, Gary. So thank you and welcome again.
Good evening. Thanks, Kirsten. That was it's a very nice introduction. Appreciate that. Now, I hope that everybody can hear me okay and see me okay. I'll assume that you can unless you tell me otherwise. The intention tonight is just to share some thoughts, some perspectives, some case studies maybe. Look, feel free to jump in with questions or comments. I'll try and pick them up as I go along. And if we run out of time, then I'll come back to them at the end. But I just wanted to start by posing a question, really, and that is, what is strategy anyway? And the reason I ask is because I actually think it's a really hard one. There's plenty of opinions on what it is. In reality, it's everything from football team structure and team selection to communications planning to expansion planning, to product design. It encompasses all those things. There's probably literally millions of books, certainly millions of experts, and even more than that in terms of opinions. I've personally ablated all of the theories and models into one summary that works for me, and that's what I'm going to go through tonight. It works for my clients. It works on big scale and small. I've used it in global organisational strategy development with organisations like Castrol and in very small businesses who are struggling for a place in the world. But it's really important for you all, I think, to be clear on what it means to you. And one thing that you would hope an MBA graduate should be able to do is to make sense of complexity. But I think it's really important that you finish certainly this unit with an ability to summarise succinctly what strategy is and how you apply it. And that's what I want to talk about now. Let's make my slide work here. So, Kirsten, do you know what?
We're trying to move to the next one?
Yeah.
Let's see if has that worked on your side?
No.
Okay. Alana, it did move on your side. If I click that, does that go to what is strategy anyway? Yes. Gary, can you see that?
No, mine's still on the introductory slide.
Sachin's just said that your internet may be slow at the moment. Do you want to switch maybe video off and see if that makes a difference just as it stabilizes?
Yeah.
All right, that's not working
Okay,
on your end.
that looks like it's
there we go.
changed now. So, video. Okay, so simply for me, in the definition that I use and how I work with organisations, strategy is simply where and how an organisation competes. And I'm going to expand on this a little bit as we go. The term competition's probably a reasonable start point. When I work with not-for-profits, they detest the term competition because they think that they don't and they shouldn't have to. In reality, every organisation competes, every person competes in almost everything that they do. And the important thing about strategy is to determine where, how, and in what way you compete. And as an example, the where that I use is a very important one. Markets is what I specialise in. That is sectors, segments, targets within those segments, locations in geography. And I'll work through some case studies on those aspects. But one of the points that I will introduce by way of helping the thinking on this is about the car industry in Australia. And we'll just go back a few years to when manufacturing in Australia for automotive was terminated, and most of the reporting sort of lauded the death of the car industry in Australia. And it was kind of frustrating for me in the car industry because automotive manufacturing has got very little car industry.
You're dropping out for me. I'm not sure if this is happening for anyone else. Yes, it is. Okay. Yeah, Gary, if you turn off your camera, it might support, help with the connection. Gary, you there? Hello, Gary?
Menu.
Hi, Bryony, did you want to say something? Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, it looks like he has completely dropped off. Hello, Gary, can you hear us? Zivit, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I just wondered if you wanted to maybe text or call Gary just to let him know, just in case he hasn't noted our...
I'm just calling him now.
Perfect. Thank you, Zivit. Hopefully we'll be back on soon, team. Just bear with us. Oh, hi, Gary. We can't hear you, no.
Let me just try again
Oh,
and we'll
there we
see
go.
how we go.
Can hear you now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. And yes, Ben, I am going to blame it on the NBN. I will start again from the car industry in the sector analysis component of that and assume that nobody heard anything after that. What I was talking about was the importance of understanding where you compete. And I was talking about when the car manufacturing sector changed in Australia, and the reporting and a lot of the political argument lauded bemoaned the death of the car industry in Australia. And it was frustrating to me because it was incorrect thinking. In terms of the car industry, manufacturing contributed very little to net economic output in that industry. And when manufacturing ceased in Australia, it had almost no impact on the car industry overall. Automotive firms competed in the car.
Hi, Gary. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but the internet connection is a little bit unstable. So if you want to turn your video off, I think it might help with the audio connection. Hello, Gary. Yep, I think we can certainly blame it on the NBN. Yes, okay, so reconnecting.
Would you like me to jump in and move to culture until Gary fixes the internet connection, maybe?
Yeah, if that works with your structure, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, it's such a shame, and I hope that Gary will be able to join us soon. The way we structure it originally is that Gary will speak about strategy. I'll then explain why we say that culture is strategy for breakfast. Then Gary will speak about strategic thinking, and I'll then explain how cognitive biases influence strategic thinking. So hopefully Gary will be able to connect, and we'll just swap the order. So good evening, everyone, and I'm really happy to be with you today. As I mentioned, I'm going to discuss culture and cognitive biases, and assuming that we all know culture and you've studied a lot about organizational culture, I'm actually going to shrink the section about organizational culture to so we would have sufficient time to speak about our brain, what thinking is, and what type of cognitive biases influence strategic thinking. But before we speak about organizational culture, what organizational culture is not? What have you heard people referring to as organizational culture when you told yourself, this is not what organizational culture is? If you can share your thoughts, what have you heard? I can't see anyone sharing, so I'll share with you. I once joined an organization as heading the HR, and I took one of the HR managers for a meeting, and I asked her to describe the organizational culture for me, and she thought and thought, and then she said, we have fruit in the kitchen. So fruit and parties, yes, that's a true story. And the stocked kitchen and all those things are not organizational culture. The values on the wall and the marketing about the culture is not necessarily the organizational culture. Fried and drinks, certainly not. Maybe in Sweden, food during is a culture. In organizational culture, I've heard organizational culture described as the way we do things are here, and this is what exactly organizational culture is. How things are done in this organization, not the values that we put on the wall or the name of the meeting rooms, not what we put on the website, it's how things are done in this organization. Now, organizational culture actually influences the way we think and behave in the organization, and I'm going to share with you a story that was shared a few years ago by one of the MBA students from a certain large organization. And what she said was, and I'm simplifying and I'm shortening the story, but basically there was a company event for a certain team, and the senior manager then sexually harassed one of the team members to a point that they had to move him away, separate him away from her. And then afterwards, she lodged a complaint to HR, and everyone who was there were invited to do for HR for investigation. And on the morning of the investigation, one of the company's executives took them all to a room and had this long discussion that the bottom line was that we can all be in the same place, at the same situation, but see the story from different angles. And the bottom line was there was no sexual harassment, and if whoever will participate, collaborate with HR, will find themselves without a job. And so and they haven't collaborated with HR, and guess who found herself without a job? And the point she was making is that this was the organizational culture. These things happen there all the time, and it's totally against my values, and I would never do that, but in order to keep my place at the organization and keep being employed, I went against my own values and behaved differently. What a wonderful culture. Unfortunately, there are organizations like that. So how things are done in the organization, it affects our thinking and behaviors, but it also said what is the right thing to do, and it needs to sanction the wrong behaviors. And it's when we don't sanction the wrong behaviors that they become part of the organizational culture. So if you'll think about all those findings from the Royal Commission, for example, the Banking and Finance Institute Royal Commission, one example there was that employees opened faked students' accounts, so they'll be able to receive bonuses and achieve their KPIs. It was a known fact. There was no sanction, not even an email going out to this organization, to these employees. Therefore, it became part of the organizational culture. Organizational culture is obviously influenced by the national culture. Hollywood, yes, will. Sometimes you find it in industries, those areas as well. It helps us to make sense of what's happening in the organization. This, what do I need to do in order to get a promotion in the organizations? One of the roles of organizational culture that we often are not aware of is that the organizational culture is here actually to protect the organization from change. So if you think about it, the metaphor is it's the immune system of the human body. The organizational culture protects the organization from making changes, and hence it's so important during strategic process to assess, strategic thinking, to assess the organizational culture, understand where the good DNA is, where the bad DNA is, what do we need to change in the organizational culture in order to facilitate the change. This is why so many transformation and change processes are unsuccessful, because they address structure, processes, but the organizational culture maintains the same. So culture is a dynamic concept, and it changes throughout the organizational life cycle, and it is the role of the leadership team to proactively lead the culture and change the culture. And the board, as you know, has a proactive role in not only in governance, but in leading and approving certain behaviors or not. Quite a few years ago, the board of Oracle received feedback, Orica received feedback that the CEO has bullying behavior and confronted with the CEO. And when it happened again, despite the great financial success of the organization, they literally terminated him due to his behavior. And what they said was, if the CEO behaves like that, that us giving him the approval for the entire organizations to behave in a way that we don't want the organizational culture to take this direction. So really, the culture has internal and external roles. Internally, culture is the way things are done in the organization, and hence it influences performance and productivity, the innovation, the collaboration, speed, mistakes, decision-making, quality, efficiency. They are all of organizational culture. But not. Sorry, can you hear me?
We can. It just had a moment that it froze on my side. I'm not sure if that happened for anybody else, but it was just a slight freeze, but I can still hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael and Ben. But the way the organizational culture influences not only internal the organization, also externally. A couple of years ago, a CIO of one of the banks approached me, and he wanted me to start working with his team on a certain change. We had this discussion, fascinating project, right? But I said to him, it has to align with what HR are doing, because otherwise it will clash, it won't work. And we scheduled, that was the beginning of February, we scheduled that I'll start working on the 1st of March, and he will organize a meeting with me with the HR director. So she came back with an answer that she's very important and she won't be able to meet with me before the beginning of May. At the beginning of May, we scheduled the meeting towards the end of May. Monday morning, true story, I'm sitting on the first thing in the morning on the train, and I'm reading on my on my telephone, and all of a sudden I have a notification that my meeting that I'm on my way to my 8:30 a.m. meeting with her has just moved to tomorrow. And every day for more than 10 days, she literally played with me, with my meetings, moving me afternoon, morning, afternoon. One of the mornings, I was already under the bank offices 15, 20 minutes before the meeting, because I'm never late. And I got an SMS, sorry, we have a more important meeting than you. Now, that for me meant I'm not going to take this project, and I spoke with him and I explained, because the culture is not there. But you can understand that the way people interact internally, this is how they interact with stakeholders as well, and with clients. And so that the organizational culture affects the brand image, the stakeholder management, the way, our capacity to change, and the way we compete. In the core of the organizational culture, there is ethics. And if we disregard ethics, we just walk as if nothing, you know, we leave it to the hands of people. This is what we eventually found, what happened in the Royal Commission. Like there was, all the processes were there, but ethically, ethic was not on the table. So part of culture and part of your role as leaders is to ensure that the culture has an ethics first the focus. So this and ethics is what is the right thing to do and by whom, and it needs to include the stakeholders, not only the shareholders. So why do we say that culture influences, that culture eats strategy for breakfast? It's basically that culture, organizational culture, is involved in 3 areas of strategy: in the strategic thinking, in the implementation, and in the change. So the culture of the team, of the leadership team that set the strategic thinking, the culture and the dynamics, the group dynamics, influences the strategic thinking process. And Mike likes this culture eats strategy for breakfast. Thank you, Mike. So it affects the strategic thinking. Obviously, culture influences the way we implement strategy and can block implementation of strategy. But I'm sure that Gary, when he'll come back, will tell you that strategy is not something that you formulate on a paper and you just throw in and it's implemented. We have to assess during the implementation process what's working, what's not working, is our direction correct? We need to make amendments and changes. It's an ongoing process. And the organizational culture can influence this assessment and change process as well. So when you are involved in strategy, ask yourself, how does the organizational culture and group dynamic affect the strategic thinking and the strategy evaluation, implementation, and discussion? What is the good DNA of the organizational culture that we can build on in implementing the strategy? And what needs to be changed? These are difficult questions sometimes, but it's better to do it before we start implementing strategies. Often I am called by management to do organizational diagnosis because they try to implement a certain strategy and it's going nowhere. And then I do organizational diagnosis and look at the organizational culture, and we put a cultural change plan in place. It's almost too late. You need to think about it and address the organizational culture at the strategic thinking phase when you formulate the strategy. Now, I am cutting short on culture. I'm happy to answer any questions or read your comments. Any questions about organizational culture? All good. So what I wanted to do is to cut short the organizational culture so we'll have sufficient time to speak about biases and brain and thinking, because I'm well aware that you've studied about culture in other courses. There's a question from Rupen. Is staff regrettable turnover necessary for organizational change? That's a great question. So I believe that sometimes we do need fresh blood. Now, we will have employee turnover in our organization. We're gonna have it, right? But the question is, who's gonna leave? So one of the recommendations before we implement a strategic change is actually to do talent analysis and have a look at who are the people that we don't want to lose that can contribute further, and how are we going to keep them, versus who are the people that are not performing or that we can change and have the fresh blood. A few years ago, I was invited to breakfast at Washington, D.C., and that was one of the participants was the diversity director of NASA. And we had a fascinating discussion about it because she struggles from the opposite problem. NASA's, at that point of time, their employee turnover was 3%. Her task was to ensure that the diversity quotas are increasing, but they hardly had any employee turnover, right? So you can't ask people whether they are going to retire, when they are going to retire. You can't plan for the fresh blood, and so having no employee turnover is a problem as well. Yes, but Ben, 3% is awesome, but that means that you can't bring new ideas and new thinking into the organization unless you blow the budget. How do you diagnose organizational dynamics and culture? So, Tess, that's a very good question. Normally, I use both quantitative and qualitative methods. So I do organizational diagnose either with groups of people when I speak with them or with interviews, and we also compare it quantitatively. So we'll be able to then, so the first survey that we do is the benchmarks. So then when we implement changes, cultural changes, and strategic changes, we are able to then every 6 months measure the progress, like in employee satisfaction and stuff like that. But the qualitative information methods provides the real meat, the real information to work with, to understand what's the good DNA and what are the things that we need to change. Pleasure. In your history, does having quotas help with improving culture? I really haven't experienced quotas so much. There are quotas now on for women on boards and their ASX, but if you'll read a little bit about it, yes, the quotas are up, but it's not a diversity of, so most of the women on boards now come from the same culture, the same disciplines. Only 2% of them are, for example, haven't born in Australia. So really it's about how do you consider quotas and what it is. And I think that when we're talking about one element of diversity is not enough. Diversity of thinking, cognitive thinking, is based on a range of diversities. The performance matrix is a good tool to help with culture, right values and high performance. Rest is retain or get rid of those that aren't living the right values. Yes, sometimes I agree that, but you just can't just get rid of people, right? We also have, first of all, need to model the behavior from the top. And sometimes I get into organizations, there is this gap. The managers want the employees to behave in a way, that is different than what they behave. So modeling behavior often is a problem. If Gary is available, then I think it's time to speak about strategy. Thank you very much, Ilana. And Gary, you're here, so I'll let you jump back into strategy and then let me know if you want to do the cognitive biases after or before strategic thinking.
Thanks, Yvette. I'll leave my video off just in case that was causing a problem. And I will, can everybody hear me now? Is that okay?
Yes, awesome now.
Okay, great. Just trying to navigate back here. Okay, so you can hear and see the slides. Fantastic. I'm going to jump back into the how of strategy. And what I'll do, if you like, I'll go through my section and the next section and then leave the biases to the last bit, because I think that's a really interesting part of the overall, and you can wrap up with that. So in the how, what I was working through before is that there's two ways to look at that. There's models that exist, such as Tracy and Wiersma, that attempt to define within specific designations how an organisation competes. Either customer centricity or product leadership. They're good models at a general level, but they're not very specific. And if you consider a company like 3M, for example, a global powerhouse, 35,000 product lines, massive organisation, in 3M's thinking, they only compete in two areas. They're good at two things. They're good at coatings and they're good at bondings. So they make sticky notes, but they don't compete in the stationery business. they make sticky notes because it's an innovative use of one of their bonding technologies. So they know what they do, and they know how they're very innovative. They make a huge investment in that. And this is the better way of looking at how you compete, is to take a very detailed look into your own organisation, identify what you have to be able to do well, and then identify whether you can do it well. You know, have you ever heard an organisation or seen an organisation that doesn't claim to have the best people? They all do, but they can't all have the best people, and they certainly can't all have the best culture. So this is nice enough. This is the thing that doesn't matter too much if it's just a fluffy line in an annual report. It's very, very dangerous if you're making strategic decisions based on an internal organisational capability. So you have to be very careful and apply very deep rigour in your analysis of your competitive advantages. And the third aspect of it is the segmentation, targeting, positioning element of strategy development, which overlaps very much into marketing. You know, segmentation is a designation of the kind of market in which you compete. That is the group, that the lumping together of areas, and the targets are who you're going to address within those areas. I was involved recently in a very interesting and very divisive conflict between a set group of members and the board of an organisation. This organisation, not a very public one, and it's not an organisation that I'm able to publicise, but what happened was it was a very effective advocacy organisation working in the not-for-profit sector at federal level, so very influential with federal politicians and able to engineer really significant change to the benefit of its constituents, that is the people who it represented. The problem was that the members viewed the purpose of that organisation as being a lobby group, that is one that acted on behalf of the members trying to gain economic advantage in accessing federal programs and funding. Now, at a federal level particularly, politicians view advocacy and lobbying very differently. Advocacy means exactly that, advocating on behalf of people who can't advocate on their own behalf. Lobbying means rent-seeking for economic advantage, and they treat these organisations very differently. Now, because of this disagreement on where and what the organisation was to do, it actually ended up in a complete, almost complete dismantling of a very effective organisation, a complete change of direction, spill of almost all the staff, and a very rapid decline in the outcomes that organisation was achieving. That came from a very specific disagreement on where they were competing and on what their positioning was to be. Does that make sense? Am I making sense with this? Anybody? Good. In that case, I'll keep going, because some of these things conflict a little bit to potentially what is in some of the lessons, just because of the way that I think about them. They all fit, but they sometimes might sound a little different. So one of the really important things to consider when you're working on organisational strategy is how many markets you may have to consider. And I usually consider this from three lenses. So I normally look in three primary elements, and I'll call them demand, supply, and finance. Now, not-for-profits are always more complex than for-profits for a number of reasons. One is because when they perform very, very well financially, that is, they only spend 40% of their funds on the organisation, they're deemed to have performed very, very poorly because they spent 40% of their funds on the organisation. Now, any commercial organisation that achieved that sort of result would be delighted. Social enterprises are embarrassed. They're very complex. But the three elements are pretty important, I think. You know, if you consider a startup, and there was one that I'm still involved in, who are essentially a comparator website. This comparator website has got to consider a number of elements. Got to consider distributors who have to endorse it and write it with specifications on the product. So they need to compete for space there because there are other players in that market. In fact, there are tyre comparison retailer. So they're playing against some pretty powerful competitors. So they're trying to compete for space with distributors. They're trying to compete for space in buyers' markets. So they need to give buyers compelling reasons, and they need a market strategy that's purely focused on the retail buyers, not only to gain their customer in the first place, but then to keep it. They need to compete in the retailer market, because if retailers don't list with them, they haven't got anything to provide their buyers, even if the distributors are supporting them. As a startup, and very importantly, they've got to compete for investment funds, because without investment funds, they'll fail. So you see now with this organisation, and there's a fifth one in there, and that's staff, because getting staff to join a startup, particularly in the technology sector, is really hard unless you can promise them a lot. And if you're not able to, then you're going to get poor staff, which means you've got less to offer buyers and sellers and investors. So in this organisation as a board, our focus was equally on those 5 areas. As it was, we were able to structure a board that had some specialty in each of those areas. But, you know, those different markets require different strategic executions. And when you're thinking strategy, it's really important not to just think of a strategy, because you have a different pitch, a different perspective, a different positioning, depending on which market you are talking about when you answer the where of competition. You know, think about investors that want a low cost and high return, where suppliers actually want a fair deal. If we're starting up and we're competing on price, then it's really hard to fulfill both of those perspectives. So, you know, that's a really, really difficult one. And so my point is, when you are thinking about where you compete, think about how many markets you compete in. And there's another really important one, and I'm going to come back to it in the context of what Zivit was talking about with turnover and culture. Staff are critical, and you are, as an employer, constantly in the market for good staff. You want people applying to you. You want people staying with you, but you also want people growing out of you, hopefully entering into a kind of a collegiate environment where they might return in the future. But, you know, having a great culture is a very important part of your branding when it comes to competing in the employment market. So, you know, this idea of markets has to be applied, has to contain all of the lenses in which your organisation competes. Now, market fitness is quite interesting. When I started to put this presentation together, since I've been working on this topic since 2015, the same themes occur, the same things that we need to do, and the same things that organisations do badly. And in this class, just through conversation, really, just through discussion, we actually were able to accurately forecast the failure of Virgin, of Bunnings in the UK, and at that stage, the dramatic decline of Coles. And we just sort of weeded out through discussion about where, how, competitive advantages, and so on. The first one was about Virgin. Now, Virgin entered the Australian market with a clear positioning. They knew which segment they were going to compete in. They knew what their competitive advantage was. They targeted routes and areas that were underutilised, and they created a good business, very profitable. And then they did something dumb. What they did was take on one of the richest, most powerful incumbents in an area in which they had no capability, and that was business travel. So I don't know why they would do that. Right, Bryony, and that was the second one. Why did Bunnings choose to enter a market that's completely different to Australia, in which their monopolistic position and supply chain expertise did not exist? You know, why would they do that? I really struggle somewhat to understand that, other than through a really deep exploration of some of the biases potentially that Zivit will cover a little later. But when you consider these things, the the thinking that goes into those decisions, or those decisions indicate that the thinking lacked a great deal of rigor in identifying what their how of competition was, what their capabilities were, whether they had the competitive capability to enter those markets, and whether they had adequately considered what those markets were. Yeah, there was a fascinating one a number of years ago, and I've used the term monopolistic there with Bunnings. I understand that there are other hardware chains around, but none that occupy their position. And Bunnings compete extremely well because they have a great depth of supply chain expertise. Now, you might remember a few years ago that there was another big box hardware retailer in Australia called Masters. And we examined this at some length. The Masters, you know, I won't even call it a decline and fall. It never grew far enough to decline from. But it's a very interesting question. Has anybody heard? So in answering the question, why did they try and enter the big box hardware market, I'm going to pose a question. Has anybody heard of a thing called Project Oxygen in the context of the hardware market, Woolworths and Masters? No? Yep, Mike has. So Project Oxygen is a fascinating case study that I won't go into in detail here, but essentially Woolworths entered the hardware market to try and divert Wesfarmers' resource in terms of focus and funding away from a resurgent Coles. They did that to try and gain space in the supermarket sector. Exactly. It gained space in the supermarket sector to allow Woolworths to significantly increase market share. Now, that falls under the what the heading because it's fatuous to an extreme degree, and you can only wonder at the thinking that was going on at board level when this was happening. But they tried to compete in the supermarket segment by entering the hardware segment. They made a few mistakes. We won't go into them now, but to drain resources from the competitor's focus is probably not a good strategic decision in the context of spending shareholders' money. So I've used a heading there called the Lycra rule, and it's my own rule. I use it all the time, and I apply it to people of my age, men my age, that ride push bikes. And the Lycra rule is very simple. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And had Virgin applied that, had Bunnings applied that, they might not have made those decisions. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yes, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So the Lycra rule extends a little further, and I'm going to come back to it shortly. Middle-aged men in Lycra, yeah. So I'm going to read you this quote. It is necessary that we continue to proactively invest in the customer offer throughout this period of lower growth and increased competition to ensure that we maintain our market-leading customer offer. That was John Deakin from Coles, and I've still got it pinned up on my board in my office. I'm going to translate that. We're just going to keep on discounting because we can win the race to the bottom. And that was me. And what happened was they did win the race to the bottom. Coles tried to compete by discounting against Woolworths, who then had one of the best supply chain management structures in the world in supermarket. So they took an approach that couldn't work. They didn't have the lowest cost base. They didn't have the supply chain capability. They also didn't have a customer base that only wanted cheap. And Deakin reversed a moderately successful position and made it an appalling and a catastrophic position. His successor reversed that approach, and there's a link on the screen there, which you might be interested in reading later. But the amount of shareholder funding, the amount of lost value that goes into pursuing a strategy that you can't deliver is always a bad idea. So, you know, that strategy of discounting works for some. It works for Bunnings. It works for Dan Murphy. They've got scale. They've got lack of competition at that scale. They've got supply chain expertise. and they've got excellent marketing. But when you're making your strategic decisions, you have to be very careful to evaluate exactly what's going on in the market in which you want to compete, and whether or not your organisation actually has the capability to compete there. Where and how are the questions to ask. And once you get through that, and these are circular things, by the way, because everything changes, and I'll come back to this in strategic thinking in a moment. They're circular things, and they have to be continuously reassessed. But the very important part that follows that, and the greatest failings that I see, are in execution. Now, there is a kind of a throwaway that says that great strategy fails in execution. Poor strategy fails in execution as well. But I very often I see strategy develop without consideration of execution. So execution is essentially project management, but it has to, at minimum, cover the process management within the organisation. It has to cover the organisational structure, and within the organisational structure, it has to cover organisational capability. If we have a culture that's resistant to change, if we have extremely low turnover, if we have people that aren't willing to work hard, if they're not engaged, then strategy is going to fail in execution, because the people in the organisation are going to stop it from working. We have to consider the economics, finance, and accounting elements of this. What's it going to cost, and what's the return on that cost? It has to consider marketing and communication. So back to the segmentation, targeting, and positioning. If you are not able to very clearly articulate the segments that you're going to compete in and who the targets are within those segments, and I can tell you that many organisations don't define that, then you're going to fail. And if you don't have great capacity for change management, then you're going to fail again, because, as Yvette said before, these are circular aspects, so circular elements, and they have to be calibrated continuously during the execution of a strategy. So that sort of summarises, I guess, as succinctly as I can in the time that we've got, what strategy is and how it works in the worlds that I play in. And these things, I can promise you, are lacking often, and they're lacking often for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons that they're lacking, I'm just going to skip ahead a few slides. Does anybody have any questions or comments while I'm skipping ahead to that next section, by the way? I'm sort of conscious that I'm speaking fairly quickly here, which might not be allowing you quite enough time. Nothing? Great, I guess. So strategic thinking. So strategic thinking is a very interesting subject. It's both contextual and it's holistic. It should allow you to consider things in relation to other things, such as an organisation in the context of new or changing markets, for an example. Thank you. Or an opportunity in the context of capability, or even a prospective employee in the context of culture. Chief executive choice is extremely. I've got a couple to work on, actually. Chief executive choice is a very, very interesting one for me, and something that Zivit's much more expert on than I am. But chief executives, the choice of a chief executive is a significant determinant of the performance and the market performance for organisations of all sizes. Chief executives with the board determine the strategy, and how well they do that. And the example of John Deakin is another one. The turnaround of Australia Post when they appointed, I've just forgotten the gentleman's name, was profound. So the thinking about who's going to fit and where they're going to go is extremely important. And once again, there's sort of three things that I like to apply as general rules in strategic thinking. Firstly is that the first answer to everything in terms of strategy is that it depends. Okay, this is true in law and it's true in economics. and any good economist and any good lawyer will start the response to every question with, well, it depends. Because it depends on what's going on. It depends on what's going on around you. It depends what's going on within your organisation. And it depends on whether or not you've adequately considered all of the aspects that you need to consider. The second thing as a general rule is the Leica rule. And the third thing is you've got to know what you don't know. And when I hear people, particularly in organisational excuse, say, well, you don't know what you don't know, this tells me they're not thinking very well. If you're an effective critical thinker, then you should know what you don't know. And one of the rules about this stuff is that questions are very hard and answers are very easy. And I'm pretty sure it was Einstein that given an hour to save the world from disaster, he'd spend 59 minutes framing the question and 1 minute providing the solution. These sort of thinking comes from continued assessments of the business and its environment, and any change point needs to trigger a more detailed review. So it could be an annual board focus, or it could be a change to legislation. One of the models that I really like is Pestel, because that really helps you to respond externally. But you also have to look inwards at staff, engagement, culture, customer, as well as the fitness to that changing workplace and the demands and trends in that workplace. And great organisations look externally all of the time. And they look externally all of the time to make sure that they are continually in sync with what's going on in their organisation. Does that make sense? The environmental elements of this are just so important, and strategic thinking relies on it enormously. One of the things that I do hear companies use as throwaways quite often is innovation. They think they can innovate. They use it as a positioning statement. They use it for attracting people. I worked with a multinational manufacturer of air goods. So they make compressors and things like that, big, heavy commercial things. And there's only a couple of elements to getting good at that stuff, and that is to get a high level of output from the lowest possible floor space. And really after that, it's about production capacity. This organisation went through a strategy planning session offsite, and they brought back to their business a new positioning for themselves of being innovators in the markets in which they compete. And they announced this to the staff, and the staff generally were completely dumbfounded because innovation wasn't a part of what they were supposed to be good at. What they were supposed to be good at was very high level of production capability so that they could churn out a lot of compressors for global market. And I remember one of them saying to me, I don't know what they think we're going to innovate. Unless we make these things hover, we can't make them any smaller. And unless we make them bigger, we can't make them better, and we're not allowed to make them bigger. So how about we just keep doing what we're doing because it's working? And it was actually a pretty good response, I thought. In the desperate need to reposition, the organisation found itself moving away from the things that it was very good at. If they'd have analysed their environment properly, they would realise they did not need to do that. So, strategy, if you consider strategy, is essentially the long-term direction of an organisation, and tactics are the activities that take us along this long-term direction. Yes, he did want to, until it looked like it was going to cost him his opportunity at the head role, and then we found out where he really wanted to compete, which was in the Prime Minister's office. So, one of the things to consider about federal politics, one is the massive degree to which they're influenced by commercial interest, and the other is the even greater degree to which they're influenced by self-interest. And I think that it was Paul Keating that said, in any race, bet on the horse called self-interest because it's the one that's really trying. So he wanted to focus on it, but look at the broadband network that he set us up in. So in strategy, the long term should dictate the short terms. So the strategic thinker needs to be able to see the fit, activity and to evaluate the merits of any appealing potential activity. But they need to be thinking about the longer term. Does an appealing tactic fit the strategy? Are there any desirable tactics that do not fit? And if there are, is the strategy still right? Because you might have a lot of appealing options in a market that don't fit your strategy. Potentially what that tells you is that the strategy's wrong. I'm pretty sure that we have all been in the position where it's hard to maintain a strategic view, and there's so many short-term demands and measures to be met. Quick wins, quarterly progress reports, monthly targets, budget reviews. These things are okay if they provide a map for strategic outcomes over whatever the strategic window is, but they're not okay if they take over the long-term strategic perspective. And these sort of evaluations have to happen all the time. Should we react? Do we need to react, or don't we need to react? Or to be constantly in the mind of any manager. Many actions are driven by short-term demands, and the share market demonstrates this. It's very, very difficult to understand analyst activity. It's very, very difficult to understand investor activity quite often. One of the interesting ones for me is about history, and if it's genuinely a predictor of the future, why do we so often ignore the past, and why do we perpetuate mistakes? Because mistakes are perpetuated continuously. M&A ventures, for example, quite often create less value. And if you do a finance unit in this in your degree, you'll find that M&A generally creates less value than the previous sum of the parts. But what it does is satisfy the market's constant thirst for growth. So, good strategy, there you go. So quite often, there's no such thing as a merger. There's only acquisition. There always has to be a dominant player, and there's almost always lost value. And Virgin, Bunnings, Coles, there are more examples in the market every day where poor strategic thinking causes failure. And informing of strategic mindset, I think that everything ought to be a case study. Every article in the business news ought to be examined, through the essential lenses of where, why, and how they compete. I was fascinated to see that on Channel 2, I think it was Q&A recently, they had the chairperson of AMP, and I think the previous chief executive, having a very open and frank discussion about the failures of AMP. And the only thing that I could think during that entire discussion was that these were the people that caused the failure. And there was not a single element of accountability that they would accept. The culture changed dramatically. I'm sure it did, because which is the dominant culture? Possibly not the best one. The smaller business was probably bought because they were very good. The bigger one was just bigger. But these essential lenses of where, why, and how ought to be applied to every case study. Family business, okay. I've actually been in that position. And private equity has got one objective, and that's to make money for the people that own it. And anything that can't be clearly demonstrated to be making money, such as culture, is often discarded. So my sort of closing observation would be that strategic thinking no, I haven't, because they don't succeed forever. The great organisations succeed with strategy, and they succeed with strategy that's developed and embedded and maintained over the long term. And 3M is a great example. There are plenty of other ones around. Some of the great universities are good examples of this. And Qantas, I would say, is one that fluctuates quite a lot. And when they fluctuate is when they divert from a very clear strategic direction. So I personally don't think that you can succeed without a strategy. I don't think that an individual can. And those things that you talk about, sell more, drive margins, keep your costs down. I've got a current very, very frustrating client at the moment who, work in an oligopoly, and they have got almost no strategic capability, and they're accidentally okay because they're not as bad as the third and fourth players in this market, and they lose money in so many areas all of the time. And every time a strategic measure is proposed, every time a correction is proposed, they go running for quick wins. And, you know, the problem with quick wins is that they often rob the long successes. Keep your costs down. Well, you know, it's an interesting question. What's cost? You know, a cost ought to be a productive input that produces an output. And if you think about it in those terms, you know, ratios is a good way to think about those things. Sell more compared to what? Drive margins compared to what? I mean, what's good look like? And one of the interesting things, you know, I was watching the discussion before we started about perfectionists, and I sympathise. But I'll leave you with a thought on how to overcome dominant perfectionism, and that is that you should never let great become the enemy of good. You're much better off setting a strategy, getting good, and then calibrating, because that's how you become great. But I can promise you that if you apply just a few of those practical principles, define rigorously where you compete, honestly and openly analyze how you can compete, and then determine what the long-term objectives are going to be, and lay an execution plan behind those, you will always succeed. You will. And you'll also stand out because you'll be one of the few that use that process consistently. So hopefully that's made sense. If there's anything that you wanted to explore further, I'm happy if you wanted to reach out via Kirsten. I've got a lot of these case studies. I work on them all the time, and I continue to develop them because I find them to be excellent. Oh, thank you. I find them to be excellent ways of avoiding making historical mistakes. So look, thanks for listening. It's really delightful to be a part of the program. It's an excellent unit. It's an excellent study, and you know, I wish you all the very best for the balance of your course. Over to you, Zivit.
Sorry, I clicked something else. Let me just see. You can hear me? Can you see me? Thank you so much, Gary. That was excellent. And I'm going to build on what you said about strategic thinking with discussion about decision-making and cognitive biases. So Gary mentioned how important it is the selection of the C-levels to the organization. Quite recent research, though from the US, but still, actually indicates that 40% of senior hires C-levels do not last 18 months in their new positions. So imagine to yourself a new CEO disappearing and C-levels, 40% of them bad hires. It didn't work to either side. 83% of mergers and acquisitions do not increase shareholders' values. 83%. So decision making is difficult. It is so difficult, and we make so many as individuals, so many mistakes, but as individuals, as leadership teams, that decision making now is becoming its own science and a discipline that draws insights from behavioral economy, psychology, and neuroscience. Now, I'm probably gonna explain a new term for you here, which is called JDM architect. So JDM stands for judgment and decision making, and JDM architects are leaders who actually design decision making environments within the organization in order to achieve optimal decision making outcomes. And this is one of the new insights and learn from this new discipline, decision-making science. And what I actually do is using diagnostic tools, we can actually understand the cognitive biases that are related to strategic thinking and risk management and strategy that not only the individual but the leadership team or the boards tend to fall into, and teach them how to become JDM architects, how to actually change the decision-making environment to shield from these biases. We will never be able to shield from all biases, but from crucial biases in the strategic thinking process. So before we're going into what cognitive biases are, and without getting into too many details, I just want to mention a few points about our brain. So as you know, we are inundated with tons of information and we cannot deal with everything. So that's why we use shortcuts in our thinking. We just can't process everything, logically and slowly. And Herbert Simon spoke about bounded rationality, which is basically we are bounded in our rationality by our own brain. We don't have enough information. We can't absorb all the information. We can't multitask our thinking. And so another interesting and related part of the brain, I'm not sure if when I'm moving my mouse, you can see, can you see when I'm moving my mouse, when I'm indicating areas in the, no, okay. So if you look at the, thank you so much. If you look at the brain parts, actually the evolution of the brain started with the lizard brain, the reptile and the limbic, and the neocortex, this part here that is responsible for a logical thinking, has evolved last. So the question is, how do these parts really work together? Or in another word, another question, what is thinking? What do we do? Like, how do we think? What it is? And what we know, or we think that we know, is that thinking is happening via two systems, which we call System 1 and System 2. System 1 is like our automatic pilot. It's fast, unconscious, air decisions. We don't really need to think, we just work. We just do stuff. It is error prone. System 2 is slow, conscious, it's effortful, it's when we're using complex decisions, and it's more reliable. So when we learn new stuff, we use System 2. When we already know them, it flips to System 1. So if you'll think about, I'll take you a few years back when you learned how to drive. In the first lessons, when we sit in front of, driving, it's like we need to think about everything. We use System 2. But now when we drive for so many years, it's like automatic. I get home and I don't even remember what happened on the way. And this is, by the way, why we have so many car accidents happening near home, because when I'm driving in a place that I've never been to, I need to concentrate. I need to think on the way. I need to, I use System 2. Whereas when I'm driving in a place that I'm driving every day, I'm less concentrating. I'm using my automatic pilot. So with regards to strategic thinking, there are two main problems here. One is that more often than not, we are not aware of which system we are using at this moment. So we make decisions, we behave in certain way, and we don't actually know whether, what leads to our decisions and behaviors. Sometimes we think that we do. And we feel that we know what our brain is doing, but we really cannot see through our neuroscience. And so the main issue happens when we use System 1, when we actually need to use System 2, and that happens often in the strategic thinking. But just in case you don't believe me, I'm going to ask Suchin to help me now and put on a video. And please, let's just watch 1 minute of a video.
Sachin, just, oh, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Suchin, can I please ask you to stop the video? Thank you. So while we were watching this about less than a minute of a video, they actually changed 21 elements in the scenery in front of us. Can someone say what you have noticed? So it was, okay, it was the butler. What changed? His weapon, okay. Clock. Okay, next to the body. So we have 2. The knight in the back changed from a bear. Yeah, 3. Body, yeah, coat. All right, Suchin, can you please continue the video?
Observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
All right, so what really happened here is that I said to you, let's watch a video, and we are all used to watching videos, so we switched on system 1 and we watched the video. Yes, some of you saw 1 change, 2 changes, but we did not see the full 21 changes, right? Now, what I would like to ask you to do is switch on system 2 and look for these consciously, concentrate and look for these changes, all right? Suchin, we're ready. Thank you.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
That's right, madam.
It's just a matter of observation.
Thank you. Can we please see again the presentation? All right. So now when we saw it again and we switched on, we were concentrating on looking for this. What did we see? Curtain open, carpet moved, so many more. The rug, the paintings, the chair moved. Have you seen their body? The hair of the body changed? Nah, that's all? All right. So I hope you believe me now that there is system 1 and system 2, and we tend to use system 1 when on the day-to-day activities. So this system 1 is actually based on the biases, on the shortcuts, on these rules, okay? And we all make those shortcuts. In other words, we are all biased. So if you are not biased, you are not human being. And just recently I had a call with a chair of a listed company, and she mentioned to me that she is aware of all the biases of the executive team, and she coached them. However, since she is not biased, they couldn't have problems in decision making. So at that point of time, I knew that I'm wasting my time, and there's no point in continuing the conversation. We are all biased. This video, by the way, showed only one type of a bias, but you can see here there's codex of biases, and the last time I checked, there were about 188 biases that were noted there. So some of these biases are more crucial to strategic thinking than others. And obviously, some of us tend to use certain biases more than others. So I'm going to explain and cover only a few biases that are related to decision making and strategic thinking, but there are plenty of others. So, framing effect. The framing effect is a cognitive bias where people decide on options based on whether the options are presented with positive or negative connotation. In other words, loss or gain. So what we know is that some people tend, or most people actually tend to avoid risk decisions when the things are framed in a positive manner, whereas they will take more risks when the information that is provided to them is framed in a threat manner. And I'm going to overly simplify a question that we use in diagnostic tool just for the example. So, but the point is that an event happened and 600 people are affected. Now, question 1 is, if we do X, you'll be able to save 200 people. How likely are you to take this action? Another question is same 600. If you will do X, then if we'll do X, 400 people will die. And it's exactly, numbers are exactly the same, right? But what we find is that people are taking more risk options when they hear about the dying people rather than the saving of people. The numbers are the same, yet people respond differently to when the information is about saving lives versus death. And I see it often happening in boardrooms and executive teams. When I once was involved in a company that was really, we were called to try and save the company from administration. And it was obvious that, there are actions to take. And when the framing was about, if we won't take it, this is going to happen, and this is going to, people freaked out. Whereas when it was presented as like, yes, but if we don't do it, then this will happen and this will happen, then people immediately went and changed their views to the threats rather than what was presented in an optimistic way. The next cognitive bias that I would like to speak about is why-ziati. Now, it sounds funny. I'm going to ask you to do something really, really funny. I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and I would like you to say Yziati out loud, because this is how you're going to remember it forever. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Yziati. What you see is all there is. Our brain keeps on telling us what you see is all there is. And so we get information, we see reports, and from the information that we have, we actually tailor and create a narrative, a story, the opinion. Everything is now coming into one beautiful picture, totally ignoring all the information or what we don't know. Daniel Kahneman coined the acronym YZIATI, and it's so important to remember it, because what is important here to remember is what information am I missing. So think about it in terms of report, whether you are a board member or an executive or a manager that receives a report. What's happening in reports really is someone decided which question to ask, what information to collect, how to collect the information, how to analyze the information, what information to include in the analysis and what's not to include. Then there are results, and they interpret the results and they make conclusions, and then they write a report and they make a decision what information to write, to put in the report and what not, and they put recommendations in place, totally ignoring all the information that they eliminated from the process. And then you receive the report, and when we fall into YZIATI, what we do, we analyze the report and we make a decision based on the report. But actually, it's not, the most important part is to ask, what are we missing? What is missing here? I had this discussion just recently when a report came, totally quantitative, number of complaints, how fast we close the complaints, and percentage of complaints closed. And everyone is saying, yes, we're making a progress. We're not making a progress. What do you mean we're making a progress? I want to know, what were the complaints about? What is in common between the complaints? Are they from one subsidiary, from certain department? How did we close the complaints? What are the processes behind it? It's like, numbers looking good. We ticked KPIs. So YZIATI is imperative for us to remember. We all tend to fall into YZIATI. Our brain keeps on telling us what you see is all there is, and if we don't have all the information that we want, our strategic thinking and the strategy that we'll decide on will suffer from it. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information that confirms and support our own beliefs and values. I don't want to get into politics, but I will mention that it was fascinating. I don't know if you followed it. Not long ago, Trump had this comment or question or suggestion, I don't know what it was, about using cleaning materials, maybe against the corona. And I was flipping between US news channels, and it's like you actually looking at a total different news story. So the confirmation bias happens not only in politics, it happens a lot in organizations and during the strategic thinking process. So great leaders ask team members to tell them what they want, what they don't want to hear. Because, if you just tell me what I want to hear, then I don't have all the information to make a proper decision on. However, many managers make these mistakes that they consciously or unconsciously, they favor the information that they would like to receive. And so people, it's normal that we all want our managers to appreciate us and love working with us. So we tend to tell our managers what those people what they want to hear. And hence, great leaders actually do the opposite. They ask their teams to tell them what they don't want to hear, and they say thank you. Yes, it can be very confronting. Sometimes confronting the truth and the criticism, and it's not easy. You don't need to act on the spot, but certainly say thank you and take the time to absorb the information. But if you give benefit or certain approval to information that you want to hear all the time, you can be sure that this is what you're going to get, to get from your team, only what you want to hear, and then the information that you base your decisions on is going to be lacking in the wrong directions, and hence your decision making will not be optimal. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias whereby people who are incompetent at something are unable to recognize their own incompetency. That this happens, there are 2 points here. One, I've heard that you're doing those blind spots and 360 reviews. Self-awareness is key. But the other point that we need to remember is that no one is perfect, and no one will ever be the best leader in the world. And so what we really need to know is to have the self-awareness and surround ourselves with people that complement us. And complement is not just, about legal and finance. It's about soft skills and leadership skills as well. Will is saying, yes, I've learned about this 12 months ago. It was a penny drop moment. Yes. They don't know. I see dead people, they don't know they are dead. Really, we speak about complementary leadership. If your people managers bring under you people, team members that are better in certain aspects than you, that will help you to succeed. But that means that you're gonna less fall into this bias. If you are part of a leadership team, make sure that when you recruit someone new to the leadership team, that you are all aware of what's missing in your leadership skills, and bring someone that complements that. Risky shift. It's an interesting one. That occurs when a group collectively agrees on a certain course of action that individually each one of them would not have even dared thinking of or using. And that's part of the group dynamics, and that's one of the things that we need to be aware of, is that biases are not happening within just within ourselves in our thinking, but they are affected also by the group dynamic. And sunk cost is something that I see a lot. So this is when we've already committed, time or money or effort to a certain project. We deep inside we know it's not going to go anywhere, but we give it just another chance, and a little more, and another chance, and another chance. It's like throwing good money into, a sick project. And people, when they fall into this bias of the sunk cost, They are just not aware of it. When we're talking with startups, for example, and Gary mentioned startups, often we say fail fast, right? In other words, don't fall into the sunk cost, because maybe you have the ability to raise more capital, but if this organization is not going to go anywhere, just fail fast, learn from the experience, and move on. How am I going with time? Can I take 3 more minutes?
Yeah, we normally finish now, but if people are happy to stay on the line, absolutely keep going, because this is incredibly interesting.
Okay, thank you. So what I find is that some executives always convince the board, and some employees or team leaders or managers always convince the leadership team. What really they do, they're not necessarily great speakers or have influential skills, but what they really consciously and unconsciously, they really found the biases of the team that they report to, and they know how to present the information in a way that will convince them. And hence, it is so important for you as leaders and developing leaders to be aware not only on your own biases, but also how the group dynamics is working together and what are the group biases. And so what I do often with leadership teams, I use this diagnostic tool, and it's not about like what you did 360. It's not about your own, but we put together those biases that are related to strategic thinking and risk management and strategy, and as a group, and see where are we biased as a group, and then I teach them how to change. It's easy tactics, it's not theory, how to change the decision-making environment. So if, for example, it's just one example, we are all falling in the loss averse. So in the framing, whenever we see the death or the threats or the risk, we are more risky, then we can ask the executives to put it on the positive, or to make sure that every report will also speak both on the positive and the negative. There are all sort of little tricks that will then help them to become their own JDM architects. And the last comment I wanted to make is about taking into consideration that what we spoke here is it's more than a semester at the university. So there are other elements that influence the biases that we haven't mentioned: group, team dynamics, personality of the decision maker. So we know that there are some correlations between certain personality traits and the tendency to rely on certain biases. And the last one I wanted to make is stress. And if we go back to system 1 and system 2, and even the brain, what we do know is that when we're stressed, so this part of the brain is working, the emotional part of the brain is working. When a stress hormones are up, it actually blocks us from the ability to access into the neocortex, or it blocks us, in other words, from system 2. So if you have ever experienced, or you know people that experience total blackout in an exam, or that they went out of the exam and then realized, oh, I forgot to write this and this and this and this and this, that's what stress does. Stress actually keeps us in system 1 and blocks us from accessing to system 2. And I wanted to finish with it because during the pandemic, we know that stress levels are now up, and that means that when we make decisions and when our employees make decisions, they are more prone to use system 1 without knowing that they are using system 1, and hence they are more prone to be biased. Any question? It's a lot to observe, to figure out in 20 minutes, but any questions about how biases work or how they are connected to strategic thinking? And definitely do need to digest and revisit the presentation. Yes, there's a lot to digest here. Thank you very much, Will. It is an eye-opening, and doing the diagnosis in an eye-opening. I just did it for someone, and I said to her, you know, you fell on where I fell, which is sunk cost. And she said, what sunk cost is? And I explained to her what sunk cost is. And she said, you know what? My husband built his own business, and we threw so much money into it. And I so knew it's not going to work. And I kept on saying, yes, let's just put just a little bit more money and a little bit more money. And 2 or 3 years passed, you know, and we're still throwing good money into something that is not taking off. So certainly there's, you know, we all fall in different biases. Bryony said, I think I do the framing one in my discussions to get people on my side in planning meetings. This is an awesome plan. That's good. Thank you, Jenny, for the feedback. Definitely will be rewatching and try to process more. And it is hard to know when to pull the plug for business. It is, and it's like you feel like, you know, that's my baby. But sometimes we need to do it. I'll just leave you with one short story. When I was called to try and save this global organization from administration, that was too late. We had an option to ask for the board, from the investors, for additional $50 million, but the investors said only if you believe that we can save the company. And we sat together and we did the calculations, and there's no chance. We needed like 5 times more in order to save the organization. But it was me or maybe another one person around the table from all the people that was sat there that said, let's say the truth. We cannot save you, the company with 50 million. We need 250, 300, or otherwise let's go into administration. And the others were so angry that we said it, you know, and I came as an external, right? So they said, yeah, you haven't been here, you haven't put your soul in it. And I understand, it's your baby. But what ended up is that we ended up voting the minority, you know, and the majority wanted to get more money. We got the money, and that money went, you know, didn't last for a couple of months, and then the company went into administration, and it's a lot of money. So those biases, we're not aware of them. I'm done if you don't have any comments or questions.
Thank you, Zivit. That was so insightful. And thank you, Gary. I've taken 2 pages of notes, just madly writing things down. It was, yeah, incredibly brilliant, absolutely. And there are 2 things that have really just stuck with me. And there's so much, I think, just as a group that we will reflect on next week. But Gary, the point that you made, it that there's no such thing as a merger, there's only an acquisition, has absolutely challenged me, and I find that fascinating, and completely agree. Just not something I'd ever thought of. And then Zivit, it was so refreshing when you said, if you are not biased, you are not human. I really enjoyed tonight's session, so I hope you all did too. I think we've got a lot to reflect on next week. Just in case you didn't know, I didn't know, I only learnt this earlier, there's a break next week, mid-trimester break. Sorry, I just haven't realised my video is not on. A mid-trimester break next week, and then we're coming back for emotional intelligence. I'm taking that class. It's my favorite thing to talk about, so I'm really looking forward to sharing some content around that. But again, thank you to Gary and to Zivit, and I look forward to continuing this conversation because I think there is so much to talk about. I'm conscious that we've gone over time, but if there's any urgent questions or concerns. Yeah, sorry, Zivit, go ahead.
Regarding the self-assessment, just look for me on LinkedIn and connect on LinkedIn, and then I'll give you the information. I just didn't have, we didn't put our phone numbers and emails here, so just realize that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Zivit. Thank you, everyone. Just checking if there's any urgent questions or concerns that we need to chat about now. Otherwise, as always, happy to chat on email or on phone. Rob, just a quick question. Once you complete the 360 feedback consultation, when do you receive the PDF? It depends on the coach. So I think there may be, I send mine just before, some of the coaches send them just after. So if you've had the consultation and you haven't received the report, I recommend following up. All right. Perfect. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Zivit, and talk to you again soon.